Well, then the question is why wasn't that considered for this? Where was their sensitivity reader when this content was going through? And it begs the question, is there sensitivity readers, are they only checking for certain things? Are there only certain checkboxes they're checking for? And are there some groups that we don't want to offend, and there are other groups that it's okay to offend? Because if you look at like the Grandeurs, the old school gamers and stuff, they happen to be probably predominantly white men. They just probably are. They probably are, And so are we saying then that it's okay to, marginalize or offend that segment of the population, but it's not others? I would say that that's probably prejudice and bias and probably not okay, And so the question is are there sensitivity readers also checking for those things? If they are, this is a really big thing that slipped through. Now, being a dungeon master isn't always easy. Not only do you need to run the game at the table, but you also need to prepare the adventures, traps, puzzles, NPCs, and other game elements in advance. Would you like to shortcut just a wee bit of that prep work from time to time? With Lair Magazine, you can. All DM Lair patrons receive a new issue of Lair Magazine every month that contains a plethora of Game Master resources to help you reduce your prep time and run awesome games. For instance, Lair Magazine contains 100% compatible 5th edition adventures designed to be fast to prepare before the game and easy to reference during the game. And each adventure comes with maps designed for use on virtual tabletops. Become a DM Lair patron today at the link below, and not only will you get Lair Magazine, but loads of extra perks, such as hanging out with me on Zoom and playing in D&D games with me. Ed and I, we have talked about THAC0 a tiny bit, I think, in Discord and our PMs and stuff like that. And now we're going to deep dive into this THAC0 the Clown topic. It's something that Ed told me about a while ago when The Wild Beyond the Witchlight came out, and I took a look at it and I was like, really? They published this? And I've seen some videos as well from people that dove into it and were discussing it, and I'm just like, wow. So we're gonna talk about THAC0 the Clown. Now, before we get into like the discussion, the controversy, talking about some of the things that people are hypothesizing that THAC0 the Clown means, or whatever statement they think that Wizards might be trying to say with THAC0 the Clown, we're gonna literally pull up D&D Beyond and look at THAC0 the Clown to set the context right before we start talking about these things. From the book Wild Beyond the Witchlight, and I actually have page references. This is obviously a screenshot from D&D Beyond, but the page that we're looking at in the actual book is page 48, and here it starts to talk about THAC0 the Clown, and what it tells you is it kind of starts right here, and it says that they're at a circus. They're basically at a big carnival type circus thing. I think it's like a fake carnival or something that does bad stuff. And it says, the central area enclosed by the wagons is guarded by THAC0 the Clown, a human witchlight hand, chaotic neutral, see the stat block earlier in the chapter, who is loyal only to Master Witch. He usually sits right outside the door to Witch and Light's wagon, blowing bubbles with his bubble pipe. All right. Now I'm going to go over to a role-playing card that is toward the back of the book. This role-playing card is on page 249. 248 in my book, but
248. My tab is on 249.
Okay, that's fair. And the role-playing tab here says, THAC0 is the longest-serving Witchlight hand, but no one really knows his history, and scarcely any dare to ask, for he almost never speaks and harbors a malicious streak that is kept in check by Mr. Witch. He paints his face with a grin and puffs on a bubble pipe. THAC0 has retired from performing and no longer stages his knife-throwing act due to an unfortunate incident that took place in the Big Top some time ago. Alignment, chaotic neutral. Personality trait, I prefer not to talk. When I must, I say as little as possible. Ideal, everyone should mind their own business. Bond, my bubble pipe, if anyone touches it, they lose a finger. Flaw, I can't stand children. They're all like roaches. Now, Ed, do you know if there's any other references to THAC0 the Clown, or is that pretty much all that takes place in that book?
THAC0 is mentioned 10 times in the book, and you've covered almost all of it. His name is only used 10 times. There is a little bit more to it, though, if you get into the details, and I'll point out those references as well. THAC0 is not alone. There is another guard that works with him who is named Burley. He is a neutral good, I believe, bugbear that wears a pumpkin on his head. And they do not get along. They don't like each other. Burley does not trust THAC0, and his personality traits are on page, or maybe it's Hurley. Make sure I get the right
it's Burley.
one.
It's Burley.
Okay, his are on page 243, and basically it says that he's neutral good. He treats his brain like a muscle, trying to keep it strong. So he's clearly meant to at least think he's smarter than THAC0. He tries to keep the peace. He doesn't advocate violence. He's just doing his job, which again is counter THAC0 being a knife thrower and being grumpy. His bond is his brother, and sometimes he forgets his own strength and accidentally breaks things, like especially fragile things. I think the word fragile is very important there as well. To a lot of people's arguments in this situation.
Now, so this is interesting.
Yeah.
It literally, in the back, it says Hurley, the bugbear, with an H. In the illustration,
there's two.
Oh, there's two of them.
Hurley and Burley are brothers.
Oh, okay. That's why I'm getting confused then. So that is like the basic, the foundation of what has been published, basically about THAC0 the Clown and this bugbear, Burley or Hurley, or whichever one it happens to be. And so I think so what's basically being put out there, the theory out there is that THAC0 the Clown is a sort of allegorical stand-in for grognards or old school players who are, maybe from the first edition, second edition or something. Second edition was when we had THAC0, right? And that they are gatekeepers and that they are undesirable or something. And so I think that the theory is that's being purported is that this was published as a dig against old school gamers, grognards, and that it's meant to be taken in a derogatory way and saying, hey, we kind of don't want you here, go away, you're grumpy, you're a gatekeeper, goodbye type of thing. So it's meant as a dig. That's what the theory goes. So what are your thoughts on that, Ed?
Well, the picture, I don't know if you showed the picture. The instructions that the artist was given was that he has a painted on smile, but he is frowning. In addition to a basic description of the character and his bubble pipe and all that kind of stuff. Wizards of the Coast has... I don't know if Wizards of the Coast has an official statement on THAC0, but Sage Advice and the artist say that, it's just an attempt to, include something from the old school as like a remember this, a sort of happy memory of the past kind of thing. Where people have a problem with it, especially older people who play the older editions, is that there are a number of things that make this character look like there was intent behind it. When you think of an old school D&D player from the 70s and 80s, in generally, look at comic book. Let's talk about comic book guy on The Simpsons. He's overweight. He's rude. He's grumpy. When you give a character a pipe, you are automatically making that character older because young people don't smoke pipes. Pipes are associated with the older characters. They made him the gatekeeper that keeps young people away from the staff. Because the bugbear Burley loves kids and loves helping young people get to meet Mr. Witch and Mr. Light, but THAC0 is a gatekeeper who doesn't want young people to have fun. And a lot of these things are associated with older players, especially on social media. They're called out a lot as being gatekeepers. They don't want girls in their game. They don't want LGBTQ plus people in their game, all this kind of thing. And in my experience, much like you have a vocal minority who are saying all of these things are terrible in Wizards of the Coast and guiding their product development, you also have a vocal minority of old grumpy gamers who are incredibly conservative, only like things their way, but they're a minority. Whether it's far to one side or another, they're a minority that are loud, and so they get this image. One of the other things that makes it look like it's an old versus new is that Wizards of the Coast right now is making a lot of effort to remove certain tropes from the game. Humanoid monsters aren't evil. They're just like everybody else, and they can be whatever they want to be. So THAC0's nemesis is a good aligned bugbear who loves children. So he represents the new D&D, and THAC0 represents the old D&D. So you have these two things butting heads. And so it's really hard to look at all of the evidence and say that there was nobody was giggling behind the scenes at how this was going to, how they were making fun of old D&D players. Now, did they mean it to be offensive? Did they mean it to be an homage? Who knows? But the truth of the matter is that the material itself can be taken in an offensive manner because of all of the evidence that this was meant to be a dig on older gamers. Whether it was or not doesn't matter. I mean, let's look at the other extreme. You know, a lot of people on Twitter decided that orcs were a representation of African Americans or black people, whichever term you want to use, and that orcs being evil meant that, you know, it was racist to have orcs be evil as a race. And that all started because somebody accused J.R.R. Tolkien of being racist and said that orcs were black people. When in fact, you know, orcs were fascist Germans because that was the war that he had just come out of when he wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. If it's true that you can be offended by orcs being evil because somebody said that orcs were representative of black people, then it's true that you can be offended by a representation that looks like Wizards of the Coast is making fun of you, whether or not that was the intent. So that's, I mean, really, in my opinion, it's always a choice to be offended. You choose to be offended or you choose to let it roll off your back. So even if it was in a deliberate dig, if you're being super offended by it, you choose to be super offended by it. I mean, even when I brought it to you, I wasn't offended by it. I just thought that it was, you know, I thought that it was deliberate. And I'm still not sure that it wasn't. But it's just the fact that there's so much evidence supporting the fact that somebody at Wizards was giggling about it when they were writing it, to make it not intentional, at least on some level.
Right.
Now, am I offended by it? No. Do I think people should be offended by it? No. I think people should just ignore it, because otherwise it's just going to cause arguments on social media, because really what else are you going to do about it? But that's really my opinion on the whole thing, is that, you know, it's like anything else. You can choose to be upset by it, or you can accept the fact that it may or may not have been meant to be offensive and just choose to ignore it.
You know, what's interesting too is that the intent is not necessarily what we're talking about. It's people's perceptions of it, right? Will someone be offended by this? And right now it seems like WotC is sanitizing a lot of their content to reduce the chances that anybody anywhere will be offended by it. You know, and there's a definite, like, we're getting an entire new monster manual, you know, that's being sanitized. It's just, we're reprinting monsters with no changes really, and we're just sanitizing them so that you won't be offended by the alignment system, essentially. And so they're making, and that product is not going to do very well. It's going to sell very, very poorly. It's going to get a very bad reception, you know, and they know that, but they're willing to spend the money on it for the optics of it, for the perception of it, or because they don't want to offend people, right? And so the question then is, if they're willing to spend so much to do that for the things that they're sanitizing in that product, well, then the question is why wasn't that considered for this? You know, where was their sensitivity reader when this content was going through? And it begs the question, you know, is their sensitivity readers, are they only checking for certain things? Are there only certain check boxes they're checking for? And, you know, are there some groups that we don't want to offend, and there are other groups that it's okay to offend? Because, you know, if you look at like the Graniers, the old school gamers and stuff, they happen to be, you know, probably predominantly white men. They just probably are. They probably are, you know? And so are we saying then that it's okay to, you know, marginalize or offend that segment of the population, but it's not others? You know, I would say that that's probably prejudice and bias and probably not okay, you know? And so the question is are there sensitivity readers also checking for those things? You know, if they are, this is a really big thing that slipped through. You know, like really big. And what I find really interesting too is the response, or perhaps lack of response about it as well. This is the D&D Sage Advice, and this is a tweet from Will Doyle. Do you know? Was that the artist you were referring to, or who was that?
Yeah. That was the artist that drew the character.
Okay, cool. And what I find really interesting about this, and my point here, well, let's read the tweet. Basically, Will Doyle says, "My goodness, there are a lot of zany misconceptions out there about the supposed meaning behind THAC0 the Clown, one of my favorite Witchlight Carnival characters. Let me assure you, he's just a grumpy clown whose name is a nostalgic nod to an old D&D mechanic." And what I found interesting about this is that if that had, and I know that's not like an official Wizards of the Coast response, but if that sort of response had been Wizards' response to the complaints about drow or the complaints about orcs, just kind of pish-poshing it away and saying, "Oh my gosh, you guys are crazy. You're making up all these zany things. You know, you're kind of saying this, that, and the other. It's not what the intention was. You know, orcs are just bad guys. They were originally based on Nazis, so just calm down over here." You know, and I don't know what their complaint about drow was. Probably because they're dark-skinned and evil would be my guess. And so you're characterizing, you know, dark-skinned people as evil. That would be my guess. But you guys are crazy. That wasn't the intention. Just calm down, pish-posh it away, and then move on with your lives. If that had been the official response, you know, from Wizards about those two things, you know, social media people would have freaked out even more than they already did. You know what I mean? And so that tweet obviously is from the artist. So that's not the official Wizards voice. I recognize that, you know, but that sort of response to just pish-posh it away, you know, when people are obviously reading into it and people are obviously not liking it, is also, it doesn't align, that sort of mentality doesn't align with like the way Wizards is approaching every other thing, which is sanitizing it, making it as unoffensive as possible and inclusive as possible. You know what I mean? So I just kind of felt that sort of response isn't very satisfactory either. I don't know if it was intentional or not. I really just kind of go back to the thing of, it doesn't matter if it's intentional. People are being offended by it. And if you are going to sanitize your products to remove things that are potentially offensive, even if that wasn't the intent, like orcs and drow, then you got to do it for everything. You know what I mean? Because if you don't do it for everything, then people are going to ask the question, well, why didn't you? Are you okay with offending these people then? That's the natural question. If you don't sanitize it for everything and every possible person in the world that could ever possibly ever be offended.
Click on the screen now to watch another fine DM Lair video, or to become a DM Lair patron, play D&D with me, and get an issue of Lair magazine every month. And until next time, let's play D&D.